Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another history lesson with me, Miss Warren. Okay, so today what we're going to discuss is the Industrial Revolution. So, for the second time in human history, we are going to experience a huge change in the way we produce things and the way we produce and manage food. So, the first time we talked about this change in food production was with the Neolithic Revolution. That was like all the way back at the beginning of the semester for us. So, the impact from the Neolithic Revolution was humans moved from this hunter gatherer society to farmers into establishing settlements. There was this huge population boom that meant you needed more food, which meant you had more population, and so on and so forth. So, we began to be less nomadic and more tribal, meaning we weren't moving around, we were establishing ourselves. So when the Industrial Revolution came along, we saw a shift again from solely being farmers to now factory workers who are being paid a wage. Again, there was a population boom because there was more food. People were moving from the country into the urban areas. We call this push pull factor. So people were being pushed out of the countryside and pulled into the cities because of these jobs and a steady paycheck. So new jobs are opened up for the masses, and you didn't have to have any training to be able to do these jobs. You just had to be able to be trained. So we actually start to see classes and social classes growing further and further apart. So with the Neolithic Revolution, we saw the social class begin, right? And how it evolved and how it changed. Well, now it's going to change and divide each class even further. So when we talk about a revolution, what does that actually mean? We talked about the American and the French and the Latin American revolutions, but what does it mean in a sense like this? Like we know the war revolution, but why is the Industrial Revolution considered a revolution? Well, that's because things actually change in a drastic way. So before the Industrial Revolution, you had most goods that were made by hand. They were made in small batches by one or two people that were artisans. This is called a cottage industry, which meant that it was very small scale. So merchants who were entrepreneurs saw raw materials or sold these raw materials to these craftsmen to be able to refine it and finish the product. The benefit of this meant that everybody in this process made good money because it took skill and it took time. The issue became is that it took too much time and it was extremely inefficient. So craftsmen cost a lot of money because they were skilled workers. So then you start to see this rise of machines. So because of mercantilism, we talked about this with exploration, mercantilism is this exchange of goods for money. Europe now had access to new resources and new markets, so a new place they could sell these items. So the demand for finished products actually grew tremendously, and cottage industries just weren't cutting it anymore. There was this push to seek out power-driven machines, and businessmen quickly took these machines and applied them for making their products faster. So the Industrial Revolution began, and it all started in England. So why the heck did it start in Britain? Well, for starters, they had a huge natural resource in coal and iron deposits. They could farm out the coal or dig out the coal right from underneath their feet. So they started to see coal powered factories. Iron started to be used to make these factories because we found a way to refine iron to be able to make it faster and stronger in greater times. So we talked a little bit about laissez-faire when it came to Adam Smith and the Enlightenment. And this is where we really start to see the practice of the laissez-faire economics. So government just let the businesses do whatever they wanted as long as they made a profit. So there were very few regulations on factories during this time. The scientific revolution is why all of this started. The businesses started to use those scientific methods to be able to create these new technologies. And then you also had government policies. Well, the English government was willing to invest in all of these businesses and protect them with their army and navy. They had the greatest navy at this point in time, so they were protecting their assets. And then mercantilism. You had a lot of natural resources and you opened up the door to a lot of markets to sell. Also, what made it easier for Great Britain to be the start of the Industrial Revolution is because the ease of transportation. They have a lot of waterways in Great Britain where they could easily set up factories on the rivers and then put their products, their refined products, on ships and ship them out. They can also ship in the natural resources that needs to be refined. So Great Britain was just the perfect place. So the first industries to actually be established were clothing, wool, and cotton. So the textile industry was the first one to start to see this boom, because if you have a population boom because of food, you need to clothe those people. So new technology made it easier and cheaper to make these goods, and factories needed coal to be able to power their factory. So we have the steam engine. This was perfected by James Watt. Notice I didn't say invented. It was perfected by James Watt. Now factories could operate and produce non-stop. They didn't have to be built near a water source. They could literally be built anywhere. And eventually this steam engine leads to the steamboat and to the train. New innovations also meant more efficiency and more output, but it also led to new and different jobs. So you started to see the division of labor get even further apart. No longer did you need skilled workers because they were extremely expensive. You could divide these huge jobs into small jobs and hire unskilled workers who were extremely cheap. I don't make this up. This is what happened. So two inventions that you actually saw during this time is called the flying shuttle and the spinning jenny. So before, the shuttle was done by hand. That meant that operators only had to make sure there wasn't any failures. So what this shuttle did is it goes back and forth in the loom, the power loom. And then the spinning jenny, before, operators could only spin one thread at a time, but after the invention of the spinning jenny, operators could spin non-stop. They could spin multiple threads at one time, making it faster and more efficient. And then you had innovations with transportation. So you had a good transport infrastructure that was needed to move these raw materials. And because England was in such a great place, as I was saying, they had an ease of water transportation. So steamboats could get in. You had canals that were man-made. They started to build roads and build up infrastructure. This is where the turnpike started to be introduced. It's a toll road, and they used the money to be able to maintain roads. You also had macadams, which were small stones that were mixed with cement to be able to create these roads. Also, you had trains. They became the fastest way to transport and move not only goods, but people across the country. So every one of these just made it easy to transport food and goods and people. These also made it easier to move from country to city. And this is where you see the growth of urbanization. So urban means city. So city growth is what urbanization means. So by 1815, England was producing more coal, iron, and textiles than all of Europe combined. It was nicknamed the workshop of the world, and this meant more money for the country and its people. And this is where capitalism is officially born. The things are bought and sold by people and an individual, not by government or the community. Like, you can go to the mall and buy your own clothes, and the government of North Carolina has no say-so in it whatsoever. After England, the Industrial Revolution starts to slowly spread to the rest of Europe and then eventually to the world. Belgium and Prussia were actually the next two. The Industrial Revolution actually globalized world relations. So colonialism gave Europe resources and markets to sell in. Europe made it cheaper so they could make more money off of it. The Industrial Revolution was the main cause for imperialism, which we'll talk about imperialism earlier. I do also want to point out that this is, the beginning of the 1800s. The Industrial Revolution in the Americas would not hit until the turn of the 20th century. So we still have 100 years to go before we would actually hit our Industrial Revolution. So I'm just pointing that out, that it started slowly and it eventually spread to the rest of the world. So what are the impacts and effects? Well, some of the major impacts is that you did see urbanization. People moved from low-paying farms to high-paying factory jobs, and high-paying, I'm putting that in, air quotes. More and more people moved to towns. New cities came with problems. Like, as the population of these cities grew, there was overcrowding, disease spread rampantly, there was a lot of crime, there was a lot of pollution. Like, this is a 1-bedroom apartment, and you can tell that they have people sleeping on the floor. Like, that's somebody's shoes. They have people sleeping here, they have a bunk above it with people, and they have people sleeping on the floor over here. Like, overcrowding. This is where we get slums, the term slums from. You also saw new wealth creating a new social class. So the wealthy and the extremely wealthy in most of Europe was about 20% of the population, and it received about 60% of its income. The middle class, which started to emerge during this time, was about 30% of the population, and they held about 20% of the income or the wealth. And then you have the lower class, which was the bottom 50%, and they received about 20% of the income. Do you see the disparities here that I talked about? Like, the division between social classes really started to emerge here. So 100 people in the world scenario. Let's look at this. If country A had a national yearly income of $1 million, then the 20 wealthiest people have an income of 600,000. Yeah. 30,000 per person per year. It's a pretty good deal, right? The middle class, if 30 people, had about $200,000 income total. That's just about $6,600 per person per year. And then the low class, who had 50 people, that split $200,000. That meant that they only got $4,000 per person per year. You see how this kind of doesn't make sense? Because the lower class is the one who's working their butts off while the rich are not doing anything. So there was a lot of issues with this. Working conditions, first and foremost, were absolutely atrocious. Most people worked between 12 and 16-hour days. They worked with dangerous machinery that they called the jungle. You had child labor in factories. About 4% of the workforce during this time was under the age of 14, and they were paid a fraction of the cost of regular workers. And sometimes there was no pay if the children were orphans. They basically volunteered their wage. And the reason why children were used is because children could fit into places that adults couldn't. Yeah, let that sink in. So this ultimately led to a social movement where the workers own the means of production. So factories, machines, farms, etc. And a revolution leads to another revolution. So between poor working conditions and pitiful living standards, workers wanted social reforms. So this is where we see trade unions be formed for the first time. They would strike and protest until changes were made. Governments started passing reform laws. You had the child labor laws that meant children under 14 couldn't work in factories. You had housing regulations guaranteeing indoor plumbing and were built of better materials. You had working standards. No more, like if you worked past 8 hours in a day, then you had to pay them overtime. There was also minimum wage that was passed. So these ideological groups began to form, and you start to see the split away from capitalism and the establishment of socialism and communism. And we'll talk way more about these different economic systems when I see you next. So, socialism basically means that government owns the means of production, so the businesses, and everyone is paid from the profits based on individual effort. Communism basically means that there is no private property, and there's no money, and community owns the means of production, and there are no social classes. I'll explain it in greater detail later. That's it. That's all I got for you guys today. I'll see you next time.